Punk music, a genre that emerged in the mid-1970s, is often characterized by its raw energy, rebellious attitude, stripped-down sound, and a rejection of mainstream culture. Punk's impact on music and culture was profound, influencing not only subsequent musical genres, but also fashion, politics, and societal attitudes. The evolution of punk music is a story of cultural and musical rebellion, as well as an ongoing attempt to challenge the norms of both society and the music industry. From its roots in garage rock to its explosion in the mid-1970s, punk went on to evolve into numerous subgenres and maintain its relevance through various social and political movements. Here, we explore the origins of punk music, its evolution, and its enduring influence. The roots of punk music can be traced back to the mid-1960s and early 1970s, drawing influence from several musical styles including garage rock and proto-punk, and the countercultural movements of the time. Garage rock, particularly the raw, unpolished sound of bands like the Sonics, the Kinks, and the Stooges, played a critical role in shaping the ethos of punk music. Garage rock, with its loud, fast, and rebellious sound, offered a blueprint for punk's stripped-down approach to rock music. The Stooges, led by Iggy Pop, were particularly influential in the development of punk. Their self-titled debut album in 1969 and Funhouse in 1970 exemplified the rebellious spirit and primitive energy that would later define punk music. Iggy Pop's chaotic live performances and his punk persona, provocative, anti-establishment, and theatrical, became emblematic of the punk ethos. Similarly, Velvet Underground, fronted by Lou Reed, blended avant-garde with rock music, creating a darker, more experimental sound that later influenced punk. Their music, especially albums like The Velvet Underground and Nico in 1967, challenged the mainstream and explored taboo subjects like drug use and sexuality, reflecting punk's rejection of social norms. By the early 1970s, the influence of both garage rock and proto-punk bands began to converge in the emerging New York City underground music scene. Bands like the New York Dolls and Television were integral in this process, playing stripped-down rock music that would later be identified as the precursor to punk. While the music of these bands was often more art rock and glam-inspired than what would be considered punk by later standards, their emphasis on nonconformity, simplicity, and rejection of polished studio production helped lay the groundwork for the genre. Punk's official birth is often traced to the mid-1970s in New York City, particularly in the now iconic CBGB Club in Manhattan, which became the epicenter of the punk movement. The club, initially a haven for bluegrass and blues bands, soon became the stage for a new generation of musicians who were looking to create something raw, immediate, and rebellious. The Ramones, arguably the first true punk band, formed in New York in 1974 and played their first show at CBGB in 1976. Their music, epitomized by lightning-fast tempos, three-chord progressions, and catchy yet simple melodies, became the blueprint for punk rock. Their self-titled debut album, released in 1976, was a revelation, showcasing an intensity and simplicity that would define the genre. Another seminal figure in the formation of punk was Richard Hell of the band Television. Television's 1977 album, Marquee Moon, blended intricate guitar work with poetic, fragmented lyrics. But Richard Hell's influence on the punk aesthetic extended beyond just the music. Hell's torn clothing and spiked hair became a symbol of the punk look, an aggressive rejection of mainstream fashion and statement of alienation and rebellion. At the same time, Patti Smith, with her 1975 album Horses, was blending poetry with rock music, creating a more literary and avant-garde version of punk. Smith's approach was less musical than that of the Ramones, but was equally as impactful in its challenge to conventional rock. She embodied the punk ethos of artistic freedom and political defiance, using her music and poetry to question societal norms. The 1970s New York punk scene, marked by the do-it-yourself ethos, was not just about music, but about creating a community for people who felt alienated by mainstream society. Punk became an art movement, a fashion statement, and a political platform, with its ethos of nonconformity drawing in young people from a variety of backgrounds. While punk's origins were in New York, it quickly spread to the UK, where it would undergo its own transformation and become even more politically charged. The economic and social conditions in Britain during the mid-1970s were marked by high unemployment, political unrest, and disillusioned youth. Punk provided a powerful outlet for anger and frustration that many young people felt. The Sex Pistols, formed in 1975 and managed by Malcolm McLaren, are perhaps the most famous band to emerge from the British punk scene. Their debut album, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, in 1977, became a landmark in pop music. Songs like Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen were direct critiques of the British establishment, monarchy, and social norms. The Pistols' aggressive sound, outrageous behavior, and confrontational lyrics made them the poster children of punk's anti-authoritarian stance. In addition to the Sex Pistols, British bands like The Clash, The Damned, and the Buzzcocks were essential to the development of punk in the UK. The Clash, in particular, would go on to expand the boundaries of punk, incorporating reggae, rockabilly, and political themes into their music, which would eventually influence the rise of post-punk and alternative rock. The British punk scene was also defined by its visual culture. Punk fashion, led by designers like Vivienne Westwood, became a symbol of rebellion. Punk's torn clothes, safety pins, spiked hair, and outrageous outfits were designed to shock and disturb, creating a visual aesthetic that complemented the music's anti-establishment message. As the original punk movement in New York and London began to recede in the late 1970s, punk music began to splinter into several subgenres, each reflecting different aspects of the broader punk ethos. One major evolution was the development of hardcore punk, which emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s, particularly in the United States. Bands like Black Flag, Bad Brains, and Minor Threat pushed punk music to even faster, more aggressive extremes, creating a sound that was faster, harder, and more nihilistic than the earlier, more melodic punk. Hardcore punk's DIY ethos grew even stronger, with bands self-producing and creating their own independent labels, such as SST Records. Hardcore punk also gave rise to a more militant and politically charged scene, especially with bands like Minor Threat and their advocacy for straight edge, a lifestyle choice rejecting drugs and alcohol. The hardcore scene would go on to influence the rise of other underground genres like thrash metal and post-hardcore. Meanwhile, in the UK, the late 1970s and early 1980s saw the rise of post-punk, a genre that sought to push punk's experimental boundaries. Bands like Joy Division, Susie and the Banshees, and Public Image Limited, John Lydon's post-Sex Pistols project, began incorporating elements of electronic music, dub, and avant-garde influences into their work. Post-punk musicians explored darker, more atmospheric sounds, as exemplified by Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures in 1979, which views punk's aggression with moody, introspective lyrics and experimental soundscapes. The 1980s also saw the rise of alternative rock, a genre heavily influenced by punk's rebellious spirit. Bands like R.E.M., The Smiths, and the Pixies took the core tenets of punk, nonconformity, DIY ethics, and anti-commercialism, and filtered them through more melodic, sometimes introspective lenses. While not always as aggressive as their punk predecessors, these bands carried the torch of punk spirit into the mainstream. By the early 1990s, punk music's influence was deeply ingrained in the fabric of rock and popular culture. While the mainstream commercial success of punk's initial wave had faded, its ethos lived on in bands like Green Day, The Offspring, and Rancid, who fused punk with pop melodies, creating the genre known as pop punk. Green Day's Dookie in 1994 and The Offspring's Smash in 1998 became massive commercial successes, introducing a new generation to punk music. In addition, the punk DIY ethic continued to thrive in independent and underground music scenes. Punk's spirit of independence and rebellion lives on in countless subcultures, bands, and movements, from the emergence of emo to the rise of ska punk. Punk music began as a rebellious, raw, and stripped-down form of rock in the 1970s, rooted in a desire to reject the overproduced and corporate-driven music that dominated mainstream culture. Its origins in garage rock, proto-punk, and the New York City underground scene set the stage for a revolution in both music and culture. Bands like the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, and the Clash created a sound that was fast, loud, and aggressive, but also deeply political and anti-establishment. Punk's DIY ethos, its fashion, and its confrontational attitude towards societal norms all contributed to a cultural shift that resonated far beyond just the music world. As punk evolved through the late 1970s and 1980s, it splintered into various subgenres like hardcore, post-punk, and alternative rock. Hardcore punk pushed the genre to even more extreme sonic territories, while post-punk expanded punk's boundaries with experimental sounds. By the 1990s, punk had given birth to pop punk, which brought the raw energy of punk to a wider audience, with bands like Green Day and The Offspring achieving commercial success. Punk's influence extends beyond music, shaping fashion, art, politics, and social movements. The genre's core message, anti-authoritarianism, individualism, and rebellion against the mainstream, remains as relevant today as it was in the 1970s. Punk is not just a musical genre, but a cultural phenomenon that has had a lasting impact on the world. From its humble beginnings in basement shows and small clubs to its widespread influence in the mainstream, punk music's legacy is one of constant evolution, defiance, and authenticity. It continues to inspire artists and audiences around the world, ensuring that its rebellious spirit will persist for generations to come.